All right. Hello. 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 Quiet down. Quiet down. Hello. Hello. Good to see you all quieting down in the food line. In the food line. Thank you, Tati. All right, I'm Teresa Osipuk, the MPC director. Okay, my first Oh my goodness, Tatiana. It's a bit dramatic. All right. My first announcement is related to our security procedures. I want you all to listen here. Is related to our ISRD door procedures. Please remember that the university building doors and ISRD office doors are locked at all times now, including during the seminar, before the seminar. And these precautions are being taken to ensure the safety of our community. Please remember to carry your U card with you at all times. If you are a student, staff, or faculty member without access to ISRD doors, please flash your U card at the door to be let into our offices when you come to this seminar. There are many of you who did not bring your U card today. We are not allowing tailgating to be let in because of the safety of everyone on campus, given today's environment. If you are an MPC or LCC member and would like to request U card access to the ISRD doors, please send an email to isrd@umn.edu. And please remember to let the door close behind you when you enter and leave our offices. Thank you. Now for today's speaker. Dr. Michelle Pasco is a faculty member in family social science. Her research uses a culturally informed lens to understand the lived experiences of ethnic, racial, minoritized youth and families within neighborhood contexts, and uses different methods to examine how neighborhood factors influence them. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pasco. Woo, here. I have to give you the mug, which you can only receive by presenting in our Minnesota Demography and Aging Seminar
Thank
series.
you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm so excited to present some of the work that I've been doing here in Minneapolis. Be quiet now. I'm so excited to be sorry if I get winded. I'm 6 months pregnant, and so sometimes can't breathe sometimes. I'm going to be presenting some work that I've been doing here in Minneapolis using systematic social observations. But before I get into the research, I always like to start off with my positionality, kind of like where I'm coming in, my background, and where I'm coming into this work. And so I use she, her pronouns. I grew up in Azusa, California, which is a predominantly Mexican area, Mexican neighborhood. I'm also a first generation college student. My parents are immigrants from the Philippines. And so all these experiences have really informed my research, the work that I do, and why I really take a culturally informed lens in the research that I do. Some of the work that I'll be referring back to was done mainly in Phoenix. I did my graduate training and postdoc at Arizona State University, and so a lot of these methods that I use have been adapted from my work in the Phoenix area. And then now I'm here as an assistant professor in family social science. And so just a little background so you know where I'm coming from when I do this work. So prior research, including my own, says that neighborhoods matter for well-being. In particular, in my work, I focus a lot on adolescent development and family processes. My work here has really expanded into young adulthood. And one of my studies here, actually, I was collecting data with anyone over the age of 18, which was kind of scary for me because I was like, I know adolescents. I don't know as much about adults, but it was a fun study and I learned a lot. But like I said, my research broadly focuses on how neighborhood environments influence development, well-being for individuals within neighborhood contexts. I use multiple methods to do so, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I wanted to give a little bit of neighborhood background before we get in. This is going to be a very methods heavy presentation and what I've done here to adapt my work. And so, neighborhoods, especially ones that are ethnically and racially concentrated, can have both promoting and inhibiting characteristics that have implications for residents and particularly in my work for youth well-being. These promoting and inhibiting characteristics coexist with one another and both have implications. Methods for studying neighborhood characteristics are often limited to self-report and archival assessment. Not saying that you shouldn't use them, but because I, of course, use them in my own work. But there are other ways in which we're trying to measure and explore the like what residents and people are exposed to in their neighborhood. In particular, there's been less attention to the observational approaches, plus thinking about the tensions between, do we use objective data, do we use subjective data, which one is, best to use, in your research. There have been some available observational protocols, and however, they tend to focus on more inhibiting characteristics, focusing on the deficits that exist among neighborhoods, such as physical disorder and physical decay. And I'll get into those in a little bit. So I wanted to go over some of the methods that I've actually used in examining neighborhoods. I've used longitudinal survey data. I've used census data. I've done meta research. Um, the I've used semi-structured qualitative interviews and photo voice and photo elicitation. I've also used systematic social observations, which I'll focus on today and I'll go over today. So the method that I'm focusing on is this method called systematic social observations. And so just quickly, a show of hands, are people familiar with systematic social observations? Okay, we have two. And so essentially, systematic social observations is a standardized approach for directly observing physical, social, and economic characteristics in neighborhoods. And so this was first done in Chicago. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Project on Human Development in Chicago neighborhoods. This was done in the 90s, and the way that they assessed neighborhoods was they drove in a SUV and recorded blocks in Chicago, one block at a time, and they would use those recordings and assess the different neighborhood characteristics. Then in 2012, Odgers and colleagues found that Google Street View could be a reliable way to assess neighborhoods using systematic social observations. They did this work in England and Wales. And then more recently, I adapted this systematic social observations protocol to assess neighborhoods in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And so we've come a long way from driving through neighborhoods on SUVs and now being able to use Google Earth or Google Street View to virtually walk through neighborhoods. And I'll show you images of what that will look like. But what's really cool is about this, it's like even though Odgers had done this in 2012, it's still a novel approach and also cost saving as well. So I'll go over some of the neighborhood environmental features that I'll focus on in my systematic social observations. Um, I focus on physical disorder, decay, street safety, and sociocultural symbols. And so physical disorder, decay, and street safety are measures that have been widely used among neighborhood research. Given the areas that I was conducting research in and my particular interest, I also included a measure of sociocultural symbols. I'll go through each feature and discuss some adaptations that I've made um, that that I've made to make this to make my systematic social observations protocol more contextually and culturally informed for Minneapolis and St. Paul. This image right here, I actually want to point out, is from Google Earth. And so on Google Earth, you can download these different overlays where basically these different red boundary lines are census tract boundaries on Google Earth. And so this is before you get into like Google Street View where you actually see the neighborhoods. this allows us to see kind of the different census tract boundaries. And so what's really interesting, and you'll see this in a lot of across different states, but when you look at Minnesota, when you first look at it, you see all these different census tract boundaries, and then you just see like this. My boundaries are red, just this like blob of red, right? Like where the Twin Cities are. But then when you zoom in more and more, you see that blob because the census tracts are a lot smaller because it's based on population density. And so outside of the Twin Cities, census tract boundaries tend to be larger because the census it's not the population isn't as dense outside. And so, but this is kind of like an overview of what I see going into Google Earth. All right, so first I'll go over physical disorder. So in my protocol, we use 7 items to assess physical disorder, which includes any garbage, litter, broken glass in public areas, graffiti in public areas, or boarded up or abandoned or burnt out buildings, residential homes or businesses. So you can see here, there's different examples. Oh, perfect. We have some boarded, and I will also mention these are all images from Google Earth in Minneapolis that my team and I have coded here um, in the Twin Cities. And so here, some examples of physical disorder. Here is this boarded up window. There's trash in public areas. Down here, we see graffiti. We also account for any covered up graffiti in public areas, any abandoned cars, which is a little, sometimes that's always, that one's a little harder to assess sometimes. But we usually, when we look at abandoned cars, we look at if like tires are flat and things like that. But these are some common signals or common examples of physical disorder in the neighborhood. Next, we have physical decay. And so we use 9 items to assess physical decay in residential, business, and community service areas. Essentially, what we're looking at are conditions of residential units, front yards, businesses, sidewalks, streets. And so that can include, for example, like cracks, holes, or broken or uneven pavements, outgrown weeds on the sidewalk, poor or deteriorated residential units, front yards, and things like that. So physical decay, I'll pause here and talk about some of the adaptations that we made here. Out of these different measures, physical decay probably underwent one of the most adaptations. This is due to implications of weather and what it does to the streets. Because in Phoenix, it gets hot and that's all it gets. Like we see a crack on the street there, like, oh, that means the street is like we consider that like a poor condition street in Phoenix. That's not the case here, as I've learned. Um, and so so the other thing I should mention here, my team, well, I shouldn't say my team, me and another grad student who did this work in Phoenix. There was only two. There was me and I did this for my dissertation work, and so there's two of us coding, so it's easier to get on the same page. Here I have a team. I've the largest team I've had has been like a team of 6, 7 grad students. So getting them all on the same page to assess physical decay in neighborhoods was also why we had to go through multiple adaptations. And so some adaptations included, like I said, the differences between the size of the cracks and potholes on on the streets, and also have they been filled in or not. And so I should also mention many of the images from Google Earth are fairly recent, like maybe at least within the last 2 years, and they're usually um, during the springtime when there isn't like they're not gonna there there aren't images like right now where there's snow. There sometimes is like a random image where there is snow and we account for that. But usually they're looking like all like this, like what we're showing you. Um, so we I'll show you some of those things, but we really had to go through and understand like what is the difference between a small crack, a moderate crack, or a large crack. How many cracks are there? Also the conditions of like potholes. I even remember my grad student told me that he was biking. He was biking through, I think, Dinky Town, and he saw a pothole, and he stopped because he wanted to measure how deep the pothole was for me. And he was like, "I stuck my foot in there; it was like ankle deep, and I took a picture of it for you." And I was like, "I love this, thank you." And so those are some adaptations that really went. And also, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Phoenix. Residential units in Phoenix basically look very the same within the neighborhood. But here there's a lot of like variability, which is really, really cool to see. And so looking at like the different conditions of residential homes. Um, and something I should also mention, we code relative to within the neighborhood. Like we're not going to compare, a home in one neighborhood and compare it to one of the homes like on like the chain of lakes sort of thing. We code it with relatively within the neighborhood. And so not only the homes, but also like all the aspects of physical decay is relative within the neighborhood. And so I'm going to show you some examples of the adaptation we went through for physical decay. And so the largest one that we have many notes for that we talk about are the conditions of the street. And so we came to the conclusion um, that generally a good street was that the majority of the street had minimal slight cracks, either no potholes or minimal potholes that are fixed or covered. We also have the, and I didn't include this here, but we have like the high end of good and the lower end of good, just to like account for like, if there was a pothole in this on this image, but it was covered up, it could still be considered good. This would be considered what we consider a fair. I think this was a lower end of fair where there's some moderate cracks, a mix of open and recently filled potholes and cracks. And then this was what we considered a poor condition street where there's many sizable cracks. You can see here there's holes on the street, some broken curbs. And so um, we went through several iterations to understand, what was considered good, fair, and poor. Um, and so this is probably one of the largest adaptations that we had to account for, especially considering, it um, like what the streets may look like during different parts of the year. All right, so the next one that we also look at is street safety. So we use 9 items to assess street safety, and street safety is any sort of aspects in the neighborhood that would make it safer and easier for one to navigate their neighborhood. So this can involve the presence of any traffic calming measures, crosswalks, signs signaling to watch for pedestrians, bike lanes, which Minneapolis is really good with bike lanes compared to Phoenix, and any outdoor lighting and sidewalks. So you can see here there's sidewalks on both of these. Um, there's this one-way sign would be considered an aspect of street safety. There's kind of cut it off here, but you have a bike lane here and a crosswalk over here as well. So anything that would, particularly for pedestrians, would make it easier for them to navigate their neighborhood safely. All right. So this measure, sociocultural symbols, was a measure that I created to assess culturally relevant symbols and resources that cater to the needs and preferences of ethnic racial groups within the neighborhood. So when I did this work in Phoenix, we focused on Latinx cultural symbols, since neighborhoods in Phoenix can be high in Latinx concentration. So we were looking at any sort of businesses, flags, murals, any sort of things that cater to the Latinx community. When I adapted this to be culturally informed in Minneapolis, I understood that the ethnic racial compositions here were different. Um, and so I saw that there is actually really rich ethnic racial diversity that existed among neighborhoods, that different ethnic racial, like different cultures coexisted right next to one another. And so I knew it was important. I thought it was important to incorporate this in this adaptation. And so I had a diverse team of graduate students who helped me adapt this work to make sure we included any sociocultural symbols and resources for not only Latinx, but also Black African American cultures, particularly like Somali culture, Asian cultures, and also Native American. So in sociocultural symbols, we included grocery stores, meat markets, halal markets, any murals, restaurants, any immigrant services, business services where you send money back internationally. Let me just check my notes to make sure. And then any non-English signage. So here we accounted for this mural to show like, this mural was showing ethnic racial diversity in this mural. Um, Down here is an example of like immigrant any sort of services where they were sending money back, like you could buy appliances or money and send them back to different countries, and also different hair salons that were in the neighborhood as well. And so we were accounting for all of those things in sociocultural symbols. And we were looking at these things, at these symbols, not only in business areas, they usually were in business areas, but we also looked for them in residential and community service areas where there was like maybe community organizations or churches and schools. So just to summarize, physical decay went through several adaptations to account for cracks and potholes caused by weather. Um, we also were identifying what cannot be coded due to seasonal weather. So there were some images that we saw that, like there was an image where a front yard was covered in snow or covered in leaves. So we had to determine whether or not we were able to reliably code that. We just In the end we decided it was not, because we like when a front yard is covered with leaves, we can't really see like what it's looking like, and so we accounted for that as well. And then also, like I just said previously, we I adapted sociocultural symbols to represent the ethnic racial compositions and diversity across Minneapolis and St. Paul. All right, so I wanted to show you some images that, as if like when my team and I are going through Google Street View. And so this is one neighborhood in Minneapolis, specifically in the Phillips neighborhood. And so on Google Street View, we would virtually walk through the street to assess um, those four measures that I had mentioned. And so I just wanted to mention here, kind of like how I was telling you that there is the ethnic racial diversity within neighborhoods and how different cultures are represented within the neighborhood. And so here, I thought this was a really great example to show here, like here's an American Indian Center right across the street from a halal market down here. And there were several other businesses going down this street as well. You can also see that there's street safety here where um, there is a crosswalk that someone's about to cross, and also the presence of sidewalks as well. And so this is an example of what we would see in Google Street View. Here's another example of a street that we have coded. I wanted to show this example to see, like, when we go down the street, we go down one way and also come back the other way too, to make sure we can see the streets and sidewalks as best as we can, especially if there's shadows covering it. You could also see we see like some physical disorder in this photo with graffiti in this area. Um, my team and I would also take a look at this mural to kind of see like what does it represent? Is it something we want to include as well? And here's an example of like more of a residential street where we go through, we go and stop and look at each residential unit. You can see here, it's hard to see here, but when we're looking at physical disorder, particularly in the residential areas, we pay close attention to like the curbs to see if there's like trash in this area. I think these are just leaves in this area over here, but there are some like hot spots where I've trained my students where if you're looking for graffiti, like definitely check the poles. That's a common place where we might find them, or you want to check the curbs where the sidewalk meets the streets for any trash and things like that. So with all these adaptations, we were able to reach iterator reliability for each of the neighborhood environmental features across. Right now, I had 6 coders at the time of this doing this coding, and I'm continually training more grad students to do this coding as a part of this project. I always tell my students that once you're in my lab and do this work, you're not going to look at neighborhoods the same way again. um, you're you're going to notice all these things in your neighborhood, which, like, can be a good and bad thing. And so we're still in the process of continuing at like training coders to do this work, and then also to add to um, we're also doing reliability, some more reliability with the sociocultural symbols. But right now, it seems like the adaptations that we've made have really worked, and we've had reliability across our coders so far, which is really great. So I wanted to also share. So now that I've had this, we've I've established reliability on this method and with my protocol. I've used it as a part of a project, and so the project that I've just finished up, I wanted to present some like descriptive data that I've collected from here. And so this study that I had conducted last year was looking at. I wanted to examine public disorder in South Minneapolis, particularly after the in the aftermath of George Floyd. The reason why I wanted to do this study was because neighborhood literature usually says that when you have a lot of boarded up buildings, graffiti in public areas, particularly the boarded up buildings part, that means that there's uncertainty in the neighborhood and there's a downward spiral in the neighborhood. I didn't think that that was an accurate description to put that lens on Minneapolis, given the events that had occurred here. So I really wanted to know, how did residents feel in this neighborhood, seeing all this physical disorder. I wanted to assess, like, what physical disorder, physical decay, street safety, and sociocultural symbols look like across these different neighborhoods. And so what I'm going to focus on here in particular are the systematic social observations that we conducted in neighborhoods where participants in this study lived. And so I know there's a lot of data on here, but we had this is a portion of the participants in the study. I think I focused on 16 of them who actually all lived in, I think, 16 different neighborhoods. Over here, you'll see where all the stars are the different neighborhoods that our participants lived in. And so one thing I'll mention is that so for each census tract, we coded about 20 to 25 block faces. A block face is one side of a residential street. And so we took a random sample, about 20 to 25 block faces. With some, it was a random sample, but we also made sure that we made sure we included business areas so that it wasn't all residential. Um, and so for the most part, we got a good mix of those 20 to 25 block faces. And so this is a neighborhood map, like I said, Minneapolis, and the yellow stars indicate the neighborhoods where these participants lived in. And so census tract boundaries don't always overlap perfectly with the like neighborhood boundaries. I see Teresa like nodding at me. I was like, yeah, they don't. So for the most part, like it's very close, but you could see, like, for example, census tract 95 kind of is like goes across both the central and Bryant neighborhoods. Um, but for the most part, yeah, they don't always overlap with one another. And so, but so in this photo right here, this is like the these are not census boundaries; these are the neighborhood boundaries that are represented here. But I wanted to show you, like, kind of like, where all the participants are coming from, and they're all like in the South Minneapolis area. Some things I wanted to point out here was um, within each of the census tract, I took the means of each of these neighborhood environmental features to kind of show, what does the levels of physical disorder, decay, street safety, and sociocultural symbols are looking like. So we can see here that East Phillips, on average, has the highest, like among these neighborhoods, have the highest level of physical disorder, physical decay. They have pretty high street safety compared to, like, comparatively, but also like higher levels of sociocultural symbols as well. um, you can see here that in the Bancroft neighborhood, there's low physical disorder compared to what we just saw in East Phillips, but they had high physical decay. So there's some variability there. Um, you'll notice that for some of the sociocultural symbols, some of these block faces, like we didn't find any sociocultural symbols. It doesn't mean they didn't exist there, but the random sample that we took didn't represent any of those. We had one participant who um, she was from the Richfield area, but she had lived in South Minneapolis, I think in the Bryant neighborhood for a while. So we included her. But I wanted to kind of show this here that compared to like the neighborhoods like in Minneapolis proper, there was lower physical disorder decay, but also a lot lower street safety, which is something that I've noticed as I've lived here that in the suburbs, there's actually like less sidewalks, like less bike lanes, less like just um less street like aspects of street safety that exist there compared to within the Twin Cities. And so I thought that was really interesting to see that just like a nearby suburb has a lot less street safety um compared to South Minneapolis. So it's just some key takeaways. So we saw that there was some variability in neighborhood environmental features across census tract neighborhoods that are adjacent to one another. Like they're not far away from one another; they're literally right next to each other. These exposures do have implications for residents' well-being. And so some of the next steps is that I'm going to overlay this data with participants' qualitative descriptions of their experiences living in South Minneapolis. And some of the early things that we're finding in the qualitative data that I want to mention that's really interesting is that while residents do mention that they see that physical disorder, they don't say physical disorder specifically, but they say physical disorder does exist, and residents do notice them. It's not always bringing up that uncertainty and fear and feeling unsafe that like traditional neighborhood literature would say um, it would make them feel, especially when they're familiar with their neighborhoods and they understand why businesses had to be boarded up. They understand, you know, why this existed in their neighborhoods. And oftentimes when they were looking at their neighborhoods, they were focusing on like the murals that were being put up and the experiences of like their neighborhoods organizing and the memorials and feeling this sort of like community justice in their neighborhoods. And so I'm really excited to do that next step with seeing how this quantitative data will line up with the qualitative experiences. The last thing I wanted to go over is like, okay, Michelle, you've done all this work. Is there like, what's next with this systematic social observations? Are you just going to keep training graduate students to to code these neighborhoods? Yes and no. So yes, we still need. I still need researchers to code these block spaces within Google Street View. But I've actually been collaborating with a colleague, Dr. Chang, in computer science, where we've been using machine learning to train a computer to be an additional coder. And so essentially, so I've been working with him and some of my grad students and his grad students to create what we call a street lens. So using a computer to also make these assessments using, um, we have images from Google Earth to do this. I can't get into the more computer sciencey part of this because we do the coding, I give them the work, and somehow it's like they let me know if it works. But we have been doing running some pilot data on this. And so I included this image from one of our conference papers where we presented some of this work. I could, like I said, this part of it, not sure what's going on there with the computer science part. But what we've been doing um, is still doing what it sounds weird when I say this, but we still have human coders that are coding this, trained coders doing this work, and we use that for the computer to make estimates from this. So the reason why well, I am collaborating with someone to do this is that I wanted to enhance this process. This process, this coding can be tedious and time consuming. And so by training a computer to be additional coder, we can increase the geographic scope. Like I said, in the census tract neighborhoods, we've been coding like around 20 to 25 block spaces. And so with this, like I can have my team still code those 20 block spaces, but we don't have to code the entire neighborhood. Um, we can have a computer estimate um, the rest of it. And like I said, this will put less burden on our trained coders. And so essentially, what happens with the street lens is it mimics the process of the trained human coders. And so our pilot data that we've tried so far suggests that street lens can be a reliable additional coder. So that's really exciting. And so we're continuing this work and hoping that we can expand this across more neighborhoods across Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so the last thing I'll say is that the other reason why to do this is, we can increase the amount of data that we have from here. So we can overlay it with some more existing quantitative data. So if you have data in the Minneapolis area with residential addresses, you can potentially overlay some of this data with that as well. And so, so that's the what's going on with with this method and what I'm doing next with it. And that's all I have for you today.
Didn't okay. I didn't realize this was like a microphone situation. Um, first Oh, okay, okay, that makes sense. First of all, this is awesome. Thank you so much for presenting. One of the questions that I had was when you're measuring I can't remember if it's physical disorder or street safety of streets with potholes or other signs of damage, how are you accounting for variation in street length when assigning these ratings? Like how does a 50-foot street, for example, with 5 potholes compared to what's unrealistically a 10-foot street with 1 pothole?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's something we've definitely thought about. Um, it like I said, with when we assess certain things within neighborhoods, we also assess it like yeah within streets too. And so if let's say we have like you were saying like a 50-foot street and there's like 5 potholes on there, then that might go on the closer end to like poor versus like if it's shorter and we have one and there's a lot of different things that might go into it too, looking at like the cracks and stuff, then then that might be closer to good or fair. Some of it can be like some subjective, unfortunately, some subjective assessments, but we tried to put like in our protocol, like all these different scenarios that like if you have this long a street and you see 3 to 4 potholes, like this is how we would assess it. Um, Generally, for the most part, we when we look at these block spaces, they're generally around like we don't have a ton of variability in the length of the street. And if there is, sometimes like similar to like when I do qualitative coding, for this coding, we'll come back as a team and discuss it and make a decision from there as well. But once we do that, then we reassess our protocol to include these different scenarios. And so part of the training comes from like us like showing them how to code, but also like our protocol having all these different scenarios because things come up because there's a lot of like different variability, but definitely something that we account for. So I don't have like a straight answer where it's like, oh, that'll be like good exactly. It also depends on some other aspects that might exist in when we're accounting for that. But yeah, yeah.
Hi, Michelle.
And
Thank you so much. So my question is similar to the previous question in that how do you account for nuance within neighborhoods? So something that might be seen as disorder or graffiti, such as signage on a street pole in certain neighborhoods might be signage that indicate neighborhood cohesion. So if it's like an announcement for a garage band or something, like how do you code for that? And secondly, have you guys considered incorporating measures of civic and neighborhood engagement? So whether there's a physical neighborhood organization or there's something else that you can get maybe from Street View or some other online sources to indicate civic engagement within the neighborhood.
yeah, thank you for that question. We definitely account for that. especially when we have new coders where I think we have this one image where it's a mural with Dante Wright's name. And when you look at it first, you're like, oh, that's graffiti. But then some people might interpret as like that's a mural. They're commemorating someone who was murdered. And so um, we, you know, I think we account for some of those things where in a protocol we'll say like, here's an example of like this mural is not considered graffiti, but this might be considered graffiti, or this is considered graffiti. For the most part, we haven't had a lot of disagreement, like across neighborhoods and with the images that I've shown you. For the most part, when we see graffiti, it's like pretty randomly placed, and you can tell that um, that's graffiti versus not. And on the something that we also account for too, like sometimes the city puts in like street measurements or things that they're accounting for, and so we have those different images in our protocol as well to account for that. And ultimately, if our coders are not sure, we do screenshots and when they submit their coding before we like include it in the data, we take a look at that and like decide like, okay, like, you know, and we also do a lot of Googling of like, is this like, with this be graffiti? And it's also, I think it can be like, we base what is graffiti based off the literature. And so sometimes like what I might think is, oh, that's definitely graffiti. Someone else might think it's not. And that's like kind of like the line I have to balance between, okay, like this is, how like when this protocol was created and how we've been adapting it, that's how we've been defining it. But we're all like, we account for some of those things to make sure like we're making it an informed choice of how that's being measured. And then the part about like the civic engagement, I hadn't included that in this measure because it's still something that we've been including, but we have been accounting for different signs in the neighborhood that we've been seeing in particularly in residential areas where a lot of people have been putting not only like political signs but also just like any like sort of community organizing and civic engagement signs that we've been accounting for. And so I didn't include it here because I'm not sure what to do with it yet. It hasn't fit, in one of the measures that we typically measure, but we are accounting for that right now. And right now it's just kind of like been counting like, okay, what signs are present and then how many of them are present across the different neighborhoods. And so we have it. So if you have ideas of, what to do with it, we have it in the data for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Very cool. And I'm curious, how much pre-thought discussion went into deciding on what the things are that you're looking for? Kind of like how did you decide? Oh, we're going to look for physical decay and disorder. We're going to look for street safety. Like those are real decisions, but depending on what you want to get out of this, you would look for different things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the physical disorder, physical decay, and street safety have been measures that were created and adapted in prior protocols that I carried over when I did this in Phoenix and then now here to kind of show what even though prior like neighborhood literature said these were important, I still thought they were important to show what, particularly when I'm interested in what adolescents, but also just residents in general are exposed to across their neighborhoods. And so part of it was like, okay, this is what we've been looking at before. These are established measures that I can adapt. um, the part that went the how I had mentioned the part that no one had measured before that was I thought was really important was the aspect of sociocultural symbols that we that prior literature neighborhood methods hadn't been accounting for. They had been looking at a lot of like social and institutional resources, so like the presence of like schools, parks, playgrounds, those sorts of things. And so some of it was like, okay, I know that these measures have been adapted, that I can adapt here. And then part of it was also like, what do I find important in my own work? And some of these things. So when I did this work in Phoenix, and why I wanted to continue looking at like physical disorder, physical decay, was that when I was doing this work with adolescents, they were really insightful in noticing these things and how there were differences within like the neighborhood they lived in and the neighborhood, like a nicer neighborhood right across from them. And so it was really interesting, like, even though, I wanted to show that, even though adolescents were living in neighborhoods where, they were exposed to graffiti and exposed to lower conditions, they also saw like some of the positives in their neighborhood, but also they were insightful of like, my neighborhood here doesn't like, we have a pool, but the pool at the community center across the street is like a lot nicer than ours. And so I think some of it was like, yeah, I put thought into it. And then part of it was also these are established measures that I wanted to continue adapting to make them, because they hadn't been used here in Phoenix and then also here in Minneapolis.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Pasco. Hey, super, super cool project. I love it. I have two like interrelated questions. One is I play way too much GeoGuessr, so maybe this is just that issue. But a lot of times I'm like walking through a neighborhood and I go from like a 2014 street view to like a 2024 street view, and the landscape's completely different. So I guess I'm curious, like, do you run into that? And if so, how do you deal with the fact that half a street might be from a decade ago or even just a few years ago, and the amenities have changed so much? And then my second question is about amenities themselves. I feel like if anybody were to drive or look at the Google Street View of like my road, they see a really, really good road. But what's obscured is all the cars that like don't let you see the sidewalk. And the sidewalk is impassable.
Yeah.
And all of my neighbors in wheelchairs and electric scooters actually have to ride in the middle of the road. So I guess I'm curious, like, how are you thinking about like the presence of a bike lane or just parking on both sides of the street versus one side of the street? And like how you're navigating not being able to see so many amenities because of cars?
Mhm.
Sorry, that was a lot, but yeah.
Oh, great question. So the first part, with the sorry, I had your answer right now. Can you repeat your first question again? Yes, time. Yeah, so we have run into that. Luckily, it hasn't been for our entire street. Like, we'll, so essentially, like Google Street View is like a compilation of multiple images put together. So we'll like go, like as you move forward, sometimes like the image will completely change. Luckily, it's not for the entire street. So, but so when we do have different like different images, because sometimes it might be one image going one way and then you come back the other way. It could be a different image. We use the most recent image, and so we count for that. For every time we do coding, we put what the date is on Google Street View. But luckily, one example that I can think of was, there was an image of a grocery store that I think was on Lake Street from like if you looked at it at a certain angle, it was from like 2022. But then when you looked at it from another angle, it was like from 2019. And there's a big difference there because in 2022, it was boarded up. In 2019, it was not. And so we account for those, and we usually take the most recent image. For the like, so there, we always have the option that for certain things, if it's hard to evaluate, I'd rather we not evaluate it than guess. And like, we try our best. And so there's I haven't accounted for like the in terms of like how busy the street is in terms of parking or if there's only one side of the street. Usually if there's a bike lane, we can see some presence of it or there's like a sign. And so we don't code for how long the bike lane is. We just code for whether it's present or not. But that's a really good and interesting thing to think about, especially like when we think about street safety, like if your neighbors have to ride their scooters in the middle of the street because they can't access the sidewalk, then um, the sidewalk isn't serving its purpose. And so something definitely to think about. But I always have like whenever we go into coding, like if we err on the side if you cannot feel like you can like accurately or reliably code this, then we have the option of cannot evaluate, and we write down like why and so yeah. So I'd rather err on the side of like let's make sure we can code this accurately versus like guessing if like can I really see it? Because we've definitely run into that, like I said, with like front yards, but we've definitely run into that with with sidewalks too.
This question kind of builds on part of Mateo's question. Have you or others systematically used different generations of Google Street Images to study within neighborhood change? So what you just decided was, you would take the most recent one, but if you can compare systematically 2009 to, or 2012 or whatever to 2022, that's information.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I have not. One, because with Google Street, what I have available in Google Street View, I can access for free. And if I think I worked with Dr. Chang to get some other images, and we've thought about that, and I think we need some more grant funding to do some of that work, because to get some of those images. But it's what we use right now is what available on Google Street View. But we've definitely thought about that, especially like how I was mentioning like the differences between like if I was looking at a street, like at an area in 2019 versus 2022. And so,
Yeah.
is there a toggle?
Right.
Oh. Oh. That's interesting. I have not looked at that, and yeah, because with the machine learning we've been using, we've been using images, and some of those images like that we've had to that we've had like a set thing of images that we've used to. I guess when we're using the machine learning, we have to use images that we've had like some grant funding to do that with. But for the street coding, then with this coding, then we could definitely do that. Just having it, but yeah, that's good to know. I haven't utilized that yet. I just try to use the most recent, like up to date version.
Oh, I've done some longitudinal work with Google Street View. Rob, I'm happy to talk to you about that if you'd like. But yeah, you as far as I know, you can't download anything but the most recent image. So if you're using human auditors, methodologically, it's easy to go back in time. But yeah, for the machine learning stuff, yeah.
That's why I'm writing a grant for that one. I have something for you, Claire.
Hi, so I actually had a question. Full disclosure, I live in one of these neighborhoods. And you were talking about the aftermath of George Floyd, and I was wondering if you had considered incorporating not only signs of neighborhood decay, but also neighborhood renewal. So if there's new construction or if there are amenities in a neighborhood like a park or a school or something like that, and what influence those signs of investment in community might have to counteract the decay that you might be seeing.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Using the systematic social observations, we haven't, but that's some of the things I've been trying to get at with the qualitative interviews. What residents they've been talking about. I think in one of the neighborhoods they were talking about, they were talking a lot about like environmental racism and stopping like I think it was like a roof depot from coming up. So some things like that. And so some of those things I'm trying to get out through the qualitative interviews, because like I said, like we haven't, at least with the established protocol that we've created right now, we haven't been able to assess like those renewal parts. But we have seen like sometimes, especially when I work with grad students who have lived in Minneapolis much longer than I have, like like when we were first doing some training, like we'll see like a vacant lot, and it looks like just like a vacant lot that has like some nice grass on it. But then this was like during my first year as faculty here, and then she was like, "Oh, that's actually where like a Walgreens was like burned down right there." And so, so I'm not able to get that with the systematic social observations, but through the qualitative interviews, we're learning more and more about that. And so hopefully that some of these, having both of these pieces can create that we can put that story together and show like both like this is what happened, but also this is what the residents see and feel, and what's going on now. Thank you.
All right, I have a question from an online audience member. How do you account for the lived experiences of people at night? For example, there's a huge difference between a street being well lit or not. Also, how do you factor in nuances like gender, race, and other characteristics in how people experience a neighborhood?
Very good question. So I will say, iteration of this protocol, I think it was in Audrey, they accounted for, they were assessing neighborhood danger. Um, I think in my adaptation during when I did this work in Phoenix, I decided to omit that measure because I didn't think it was just really hard to get reliability across coders accounting for all those different social positionalities. Because me as like, a woman of color walking at night in my neighborhood, regardless of, like I live in Northeast, I feel like I'm in a safe neighborhood. If I'm walking at night, I'm never gonna feel safe. Um, and so we, so like at least for that, for why I haven't included like those aspects of neighborhood danger in this, because the systematic social observations protocol is trying to be as, from the researcher perspective, objective. We see whether something is present or not present for the most part. Um, and so this protocol guides us to assess like the conditions in these neighborhoods, regardless of what what background you're coming from. Some other measures like danger and stuff is just really hard for us to account for because like how I was saying, like thinking about your gender identity, your ethnic racial background, like my husband feels safe in our neighborhood all the time and can walk at night, but I don't feel necessarily feel that way. And so so the way that the other measures are set is that we can, train our students, train my grad students and other team members to code as objectively as possible because they're essentially using this protocol to guide their coding. So,
Okay, so it sounds like the coders do this quantitative scoring of the streets, and then the interviews are qualitative. Have you thought about, or maybe you do, have the respondents in the neighborhoods do the coding and look at where the sort of the unreliability might give you some insights into what their perceptions of these measures?
yeah, thank you for that. That is a really interesting idea, and I've done some of it, and not particularly like where I've had residents like gone on Google Street View and coded them themselves. I've shown images like photos to. So part of these qualitative interviews, I've showed them images in the neighborhood and asked them to point out what they see as a to see like like are they noticing like the physical disorder she see like without like telling them like tell me which parts are physical disorder decay or like to see what they are noticing in their at least these photos that are across like these particularly in South Minneapolis where I've done some of that work. In another study, what I did with adolescents, we had them take pictures of the strengths and challenges of their neighborhood, and so some of those like physical disorder came up because they were taking pictures of graffiti. They were taking a picture of like a tree because they're like, oh, this is like a nice part of my neighborhood. And so I've gotten it at different ways. I haven't done it where we've had them walk through Google Street View, but certainly a really great idea. And I've done it in different ways to kind of see what they're focusing on. Like, I think, we always say, like, as researchers, like, even though I'm saying, like, these are objective measures, I'm still choosing them, saying, like, this is what I think is important. And so through those interviews, it's like, tell me what you think is important and what you want to point out in your neighborhood through either photos that they take or photos that I show them.
Okay, I think it's a good last question. Thank you so much for sharing with us this incredible data set, Dr. Pasco. My question for you is, okay, imagine a perfect world in which the data set's complete. What's next? What's like the next question? What do we do with this data? What does this help us answer? And what kind of avenues for investigation can this spark for either new researchers or for yourself?
That is a great question that I wish I knew the answer to. I think and I've talked to Claire about this, like in a perfect world, I have all the areas that I've done neighborhood research in, I'd have full data sets to particularly so that I could essentially overlay it with different with different data sets, particularly since I'm interested in youth and adolescents, seeing how these different aspects of like the neighborhood is really affecting, particularly like I'm really interested in their aspect in their the development like of their ethnic racial identity. Does this make them feel more positively or negatively towards like, their ethnic racial identity living in a neighborhood where, people might think like, oh, this is a bad neighborhood because there's high physical disorder and decay, but um, there's all these other like positive aspects that we're not like thinking about. And so I think that's one of the next steps like I really like hope to do. Like some of my next steps is overlaying this with some publicly available data. Um, and so particularly with youth data, but I would love to be able to just um like collect my own and use like the measures like that I want to do and enhance like I think we're able to capture a lot like with these four different measures, but there's also a lot that we're not capturing um as well. And then I think I cited my 2023 paper. What I really like about that paper and that I would love to do more with is I'm showing the things that us as researchers think are important, um, but allowing youth to tell us what's important as well. And so perhaps creating like a protocol of like, this is what we need to be like highlighting in these neighborhoods and not just focusing on, the physical disorder, decay, street safety. Because there's some like, how like you had asked me earlier, what thought went into it. And part of it's like, yeah, I put a lot of thought into like, these measures and adapting it, but I'm also using prior literature to inform what I think is important. And so yeah, there's a lot of things I'd love to do with it, but I think the first part is to really scale this up because our geographic scope for the most part is still a little limited, but it's definitely larger than what I did in Phoenix. So happy with what I did there.
All right. Well, let's everyone thank Dr. Pasco. It's a great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For coming here today. Great work.
Thank you.